So welcome to the next installment of our European policy consultations, which were meant to be conversations within the context of the European Academy of Religion, not only because we love to be together at the European Academy of Religion, but because this special event, which happens once a year, also brings together scholars as well as policymakers to engage on broad range of religious studies, but also to bring scholars with policymakers to talk about emerging policy spaces as far as religion is concerned. And many of us have been involved in multiple settings on issues such as religion and sustainable development within the context of the G20 Interfaith Summit, but also an interfaith dialogue in the context of the great work CAICID has been doing, and very specific topics ranging from hate speech, religion and security, religious literacy, and as I added in my first session, bringing closer religious literacy for diplomats and policymakers, but also religions or religious leaders literacy at a higher level to be able to engage in a meaningful way with policy action points. And we have always tried to bring the religious leaders as well as policymakers and scholars in this conversation to make each work more meaningful to that. So the other aspect which we have brought into this conversation is a preparation for the forthcoming G20 Interfaith Summit, which the forthcoming Ministerial on International Religious Freedom, which is about to start in less than 2 weeks in London, and will bring more than 50 foreign ministers from all over the world to discuss freedom of religion and belief, as a follow-up to a number of ministerial meetings which have been started and continued by the State Department. And in connection with that, we started a number of deep dive conversations about protection of religious cultural heritage. Different approaches, legal as well as anthropological, philosophical, driven by religious perspectives, as well as driven by legal or policy-driven perspectives. And several sessions in these policy dialogues have propelled those conversations with different scholars, different religious leaders, different policymakers, trying to unpack the problems. We ask different questions in each session, we go deeper, and we still feel that we have just scratched the surface. And I'm sure that this session is not going to be an exception to that rule, but I'm sure that we have great fun and we'll learn a lot from each other. I'm very pleased to have Mario. You could come with us because you're in this session. I'm pleased to have in this roundtable format conversation great colleagues and great friends. Alberto Meloni, who's one of our hosts, he's the UNESCO chair at Bologna, and Alberto and I have done a number of projects on protection of religious sites, among many other things we've done together. And last time we did that in Jerusalem, in the majestic site of Tantur Ecumenical Institute. Jose Casanova, another great friend from Georgetown, with whom we also did a great conference on religious sites and other aspects of law and religion in Van Leer many years ago. Eli Ors, a great friend from Athens, whose psyche is between Athens and Constantinople, who has done a great work on the Greek community of Constantinople and their repatriation to mainland Greece after the Cyprus crisis, And we have talked a lot about memories and intangible heritage of Constantinople, but also how culture travels with refugees, and linking this whole question of refugees, culture, relationship between places and memories of places, and so on and so forth. And Mario Rica, who is a great friend and a great scholar from the University of Parma, with whom we do a lot on legal semiotics and a number of other things. So, I'll pitch the start of the conversation with a few reflections which I had before we kick off, and then I will run it in a conversational format for the rest of the session. So, the war in Ukraine has become another sober reminder that cultural heritage of religious significance, or as the UNESCO system refers to it as cultural heritage of religious use, has become central for our strategic imaginations as an international community. And those strategic imaginations also include creating of concrete optics regarding the critical importance of religion as strategic marker for shaping of foreign policy. From the commitment to sustainable development to strategic recalibration of geopolitics and civic spaces, from early warning mechanisms which capture threats and challenges to civic and political borders, to protect and prevent strategies which safeguard cultures under fire, as well as counter extremist ideologies which challenge particular cultures' rights to exist, and at the same time weaponizes religion and culture to create a metaverse which challenges our own society's foundations based on democracy, human rights, rule of law, tolerance, and dialogue. The international community in this context stands rather idle to such threats, and a strategic commitment to systemic and innovative protection of cultural heritage of religious significance in war as well in peace will have to reflect our commitment to our foundational political values, and will counter decisively and finally more effectively any political projects which weaponize religion and culture to undermine them. We've seen those trends from Turkey to India, from Nagorno-Karabakh through Ruski Mir and the war of Yugoslavia, as well as the war in Ukraine. We have seen the weaponization of cultural heritage in many ways as a way of reconfiguration the new generation of geopolitics plus. And we increasingly talk more and more about the interdependence between tangible and intangible cultural heritage, and try to dismantle this understanding that we either protect cultural heritage, which is buildings and places, or cultural heritage, which is expressions, folklore, and so on and so forth. With the process of dismantling of churches in Cyprus, which end up sold in Christie's or Sotheby's, this is no longer the case. Churches become intangible commodity in the same way any other intangible objects could be bought and sold. And the international community has in many ways lagged behind in terms of trying to engage with those questions. Alberto Meloni, what is your sense of that? You're chair in, you're one of the UNESCO chairs, and we have had those conversations. How do the UNESCO chairs engage with those issues, and what difference they could make? What is your sense?
How many days I have to answer? So thank you. Well, my sense is both deriving from the experience of the UNESCO Forum and the IF20 experience of last September. I must confess that in February, I thought that when in September at the Interfaith Forum, we suggested to the G20 to add to the 3 Ps of the Italian program, people, planet, and prosperity, the P of peace, we were not wrong. We were not wrong. Because what is happening in the eastern border of Europe, between the European Europe and Russian Europe, is something that is challenging us very much, and is changing also the perspective on the issue of cultural heritage. Never like now, cultural heritage has been part of a disputed area in which not only buildings, commodities, and things, but also the very meaning of places, commodities, and things is called into a debate. In this sense, what we've done with the UNESCO chairs in Jerusalem, Peter was recalling this, was a reflection on naming the sacred place. We used this title, naming the sacred, and we discussed on different ways in which political changes changed the way in which objects and places have been understood. This is a very global phenomenon. It is a very challenging aspect. And there is one point that I'd like to underline in this first couple of minutes intervention. To protect the places does not mean to protect the meaning. You have a meaning that is much beyond the very structural and physical aspect of the things. And what now is at stake is the nature of the places. One of the research that we are doing here in Bologna and Palermo is a research concerning the killing of people in the places of prayer. We started with 1982, 40 years, with the attack to the synagogue in Rome of October the 9th, 1982. We could have started in many other ways, but this is what we have decided to do. And up to now, we are counting thousands of attacks in which people in the places of prayer have been killed by terrorist attack, bombing, or whatever other instrumented tool. And it is a widespread practice involving Muslim against Christian, Christian against Muslim, Jews against, and Muslim against Muslim, Christian against Christians. And so there is the sense that we are not in a position in which there is a neutral judge and a neutral observer who can say, boy, you should improve your behavior. You can do better. We are all involved in the crime. We are all involved as victims. We are all involved as perpetrators, one way or another. So the protection of the sacred place is a topic of international politics because the fact that they are so frequently object of murders and massacres says that there is something to rebuild in the meaning of the sacred places. I'm one of those who had sometimes very, not necessarily kind, debate with some Catholic bishops who underline the cultural value of the heritage and the cultural artistic patrimony of this country. They say the taxpayer should spend money for restoring churches and so on because they are part of the cultural patrimony of the country. This is true, but they are part of the cultural patrimony of the country because they are, or they were, patrimony of the spiritual patrimony of the country. And in this sense, the protection and the use of the places is very relevant. This is true not only here, but also with the other areas and other movements. The one that I'd like to mention to you, because it is today the object of a discussion, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Rome in the cooperation, the national cooperation debate. Do you remember what happened to the artistic patrimony of Cyprus after the war? And I was a good friend of Dominique de Menil, who was an art collector in Houston, and also a very committed person in the field of human rights, who bought a chapel in London, and she rebuilt the chapel bombed during the war in Houston, Texas. But it's not only the artistic aspect of cultural heritage, there is also a more invisible aspect of cultural heritage that asks for a response on their intrinsic value of that. During the war in Syria, many American universities started to offer salvation for the Christian manuscript of the Christian churches. And so they went, they made digital copies, they take the digital copies to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, and they left the manuscript there somewhere with a copy of this. This was a way to deprive a territory of the reason of going there, because now it is much easier for us to do this. When the Syriac Patriarch, that's Sephram, came here for looking to manuscript, I will tell you something about. He was very persuaded that it was his duty to ask the restitution of the manuscript taken in the first half of the 20th century. And so to protect the objects is not only to protect the preservation for a certain number of years, but preservation of the meaning. For the reason I'm very happy, because we did discover in Al-Kosh, in northern Iraq, the only surviving manuscript of the liturgical, canonical, and conciliar tradition of the Syriac Church, the Baghdad 509. Everybody says since the end of the 18th century that Baghdad 509 was lost. There are two copies of the Baghdad 509 made in the 18th century, both in Rome and Paris, and they said we have no way to get the Baghdad 509. The Baghdad 509 was protected and taken out of any type of scholarly approach for centuries, because the idea that it could be destroyed or taken in another place was so scaring for the monks of the Basilian order. They preferred to deny to have it in their own things. When we started to work with the critical edition of the Syriac councils, I was looking for the Baghdad 509. And at the end of a long series of research, indeed, somebody gave to me the WhatsApp number of a monk. And I wrote to him, you know, we are looking for the Baghdad 509. I think that it should be somewhere. And he responded to me, what do you want to do? And I said, nothing, to come and to read it. And he said, coming here? I said, yes, of course. And he said, but don't you prefer digital copy for... And I said, no, not at all. I don't want to make a digital copy. If you want a digital copy, I can keep a digital copy in a bank, just in case something happens. But it must stay there, and it should be there. And he said to me with WhatsApp a picture and said, is this Baghdad 509? And I said, yes. This afternoon, I'm just coming to North Iraq. By other business, I will come to see it. And I went, and we have built the Scriptorio Syriacum in Erbil. 1,500 manuscripts did appear from the night of the past 2 centuries. And this, for me, it's important because it says that it is not simply the physical preservation, but also preservation of the meaning. Yeah. And in this sense, scholars, we are usually so proud and superb to think that they must teach to diplomats, bishops, imam, rabbis, and what to do. Should also be careful, because they too can become part of the destruction, not of the object, but of the meaning. And sometimes preserving the object will be a way of destroying the meaning. And so the situation is very delicate and complex when we speak about that.
And indeed, and we've seen it increasingly as an emerging challenge and opportunity, this fusion between tangible and intangible, particularly when the change of the status of Hagia Sophia took place. And several Byzantinists flagged that, so that it is very important for any political or civic community to initiate itself to the intangible processes associated with the place. They may be liturgical, but they also be devotional in terms of attending something as a museum or appreciating it for its architecture and other values. And the point, and the examples they were making in relation to Hagia Sophia was, what happens when you change a very little in a particular place to kind of remove most of its identity markers. And I don't mean just religious markers, but aspects of its intangible heritage. And so I don't know how many of you have traveled to know Hagia Sophia well, but there is the floor of Hagia Sophia has this unique marble, which is green marble, and it's carved in such a way that it resembles the waves of the sea. And at particular times of the day, this unique architectural shape of the building moves the light in different ways. And at a given time of the day, the light and the marble play such an optical illusion that you feel as if you're walking on waters. Now, if you put a carpet on it, that's gone. First of all, you can't have it. You cannot see it. But also the next aspect of the acoustics of the building, which is a very particular, unique wet acoustic, is not going to work because the carpet would kill reverberation. And people started talking about this. In order to capture all these different tangible and intangible dimensions, the light, the sound, and everything through which a particular building speaks, you also have to appreciate that with building comes memories, multiple identities, different ways you engage with this building, and you cannot just capture one or another. You have to have all those different layers in exactly the same way. Scriptoria and religious sites also resemble the traffic of people, pilgrimages. People go and read books rather than something which is remote from our identity. And now it's time to bring Jose into the conversation. We've had a lot of conversations about protection of religious sites. And last time I saw you at a virtual conference in Van Leer again, which felt almost like a reunion. And obviously now you've probably have developed further some of the ideas you presented at this conference, because Ukraine added some new dimensions, but it nevertheless did not change in many ways the model through which you approach religious sites, through the lens of secularization and the way we imagine religious places.
Yes, but before getting to this abstract level, let me address directly what I think is the meaning of the war in Ukraine, which I would call it the war on Ukraine, this special military operation, which cannot even be called a war. It's illegal to call it a war in Russia, because for them it's not a war of aggression to another country. It's an internal affair of denazification of the Ukrainian people, of the Ukrainian language, of the Ukrainian religion, to make it all Russian again. This is basically the official purpose of the war. So it's not only about things, commodities, it's about the very name, the very identity of the Ukrainian people, and their right to have this identity, this culture, these memories, this history. And of course, this is done by a superpower, a nuclear superpower, which happens to preside the Security Council of the United Nations, and therefore makes evident basically the specific moment we are in, which we have to put everything much more bluntly. I mean, it reminds me of what Pope Francis says very, very bluntly in Fratelli Tutti. I don't remember the paragraph, but coming out of the pandemic and seeing how the pandemic has exacerbated all of our global challenges, and how basically he says whoever thinks that we only need to somehow reform the existing institutions and tweak around and then is kidding. We are kidding ourselves if we think that we have to address this issue more systematically. We are in a moment in which neither Davos, the system of the world capitalist system, can address the global challenges, nor our international system can address those global challenges. It is very evident. So the question is, what do religions have to do with it? Obviously, finally, the secular institutions now accepting that the religion is not only a problem, so let help us somehow help G20, G7. I think we have to be more radical in our attempts and challenge much more, not to present an alternative to the system, but certainly to supplement what we have. Very clearly, the international system of states cannot address any of the global challenges, neither the ecological nor the economic injustice and inequality, nor the public health crisis, nor the crisis of refugees and immigration. And now all these crises have been exacerbated by a war that the international system not only cannot address, but actually is fomenting to continue in a way that simply is not solving, is neither protecting, let's say, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian heritage, nor obviously is exacerbating, because the hunger crisis is going to be exploded all over Africa and the Middle East. So we can, I think, simply talk of heritage and cultural. We have to be much more blunt in really facing and addressing the global challenges we're facing.
But could I challenge you further?
Yes.
That your reluctance to start with what you consider an abstract aspect of your own work is actually very relevant precisely in dealing with these challenges, because in a way the war in Ukraine links the conversation with this emergence of what I call the metaverse of orthodoxy, metaverse of Ruski Mir, this kind of parallel universe of understanding the world and claiming anything from modern Hindu nationalism to radical Islam or Russian Orthodoxy as the pure form of one form of religion or another, but used as a package to package something which would not be considered acceptable as a cultural form or a cultural expression in a secular society. But as long as it is packaged as religion, it immediately creates a chilling effect to have a real debate to what extent this expression of religion is adequate, legitimate, or authentic enough. And in a way, it also creates challenges for us to go beyond the places and start really dealing with narratives.
Well, I mean, now that you asked me to remember my own presentation at the Van Leer Institute, basically the argument was, and it began with Hagia Sophia, it began with all kinds of sacred spaces, with the reconstruction of the Church of the Resurrection, how out of the project of the 1812 victory against Napoleon, and how it has been reconstructed after having been a Stalinist, destroyed by the Soviets, becoming a Stalinist pool, and now reconstructed as a sacred cathedral to Russian military heroes, and so on. Yes, the argument is we have to desacralize these places from the sacred nation state. That only if these sacred places are open for everybody, they become really sacred places for humanity, not for any nation state, then they will be secure. So this is the problem of Jerusalem, this is the problem of Hagia Sophia, and obviously I put the example of, if you wish, modern sacred La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, that precisely because it's not controlled neither by the Catholic Church nor the Catalan government or the Spanish government, actually has a multiplicity of sacred values for all kinds of different people. So it has a value beyond Catholicism, beyond Spain, beyond Catalonia. You have a lot of pilgrims from Japan who continue coming for decades and so on. So yes, there is an element in which I am saying we need to denationalize and basically create truly secular states that do not get involved in sacralizing places for the nation. So in this respect, yes, I think that this is part of this argument. And of course, I mean, I know that all these people that are arguing against the ethnophilitism of the Ukrainian churches, which of course is a ethnophilitism which is not very dangerous because they can never become national churches, precisely because of the pluralism of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church, and all the other groups. There can be no Ukrainian national church, which is basically used by the state for whichever sacralization of the nation. So this is, if you wish, something that preserves Ukrainian nationalism, which is not an ethnic nationalism, it's a civic nationalism that is both Russian and Ukrainian and Orthodox and Greek Catholic and Jew and Muslim. And so yes, we have to protect this particular form of cultural heritage that allows different people, different religions, different languages, different cultures to work, to live together in Ukraine. So yes, in this respect, I would argue that this is what precisely what is at stake, if you wish, in the model of Ukraine versus the model of Russia that basically tries to sacralize for the nation whichever sacred places there are. So yes, it is, but I thought that this was not what I was supposed to say. But anyhow, yes, I agree that this is part of the argument for the need in our global age to deterritorialize religions, to desacralize nations and peoples, and to sacralize humanity, to sacralize the individual, and therefore the need to create these structures in which states are not used precisely to sacralize and to use the violence, the state violence, to sacralize particular groups, particular nations, but rather to protect the rights of every individual citizen, irrespective of language, religion, ethnicity, etc. So yes, it's an argument for the need for secular states that protect the religious, I mean the sacred dignity of every individual and protect a space for religious pluralism and for interreligious cooperation and working together.
Well, we like everything you have to say because our conversations are always very lively and very interesting, and the format we are running is very conversational and therefore gives us a chance to really bring in and blend in different angles. Eli, you have obviously done a lot of work on the way post-Ottoman subjects move places, and you yourself, in a way, have moved countries, and you've done a great work on the Greeks in Constantinople, and they're moving to mainland Greece. And obviously this has risen a lot of questions about relationship between places, spaces, memories, how does culture travel, and how do we imagine places we cannot be in anymore and reimagine them in a different context, including by having football teams of Constantinopolitan Greeks in mainland Greece. So how does this relationship between physical places and spaces, material culture and memories emerges in your work?
Thank you very much for this, for the opportunity of being here as well. You were saying in the beginning we're here not because we love to be together, which for me is the reverse. I'm here because I like to be among colleagues and to learn, because wonderful topics have already come up in this way through. So if anything, my contribution is going to be modest, and I would like to use my liberty of being a social anthropologist by drawing on some personal anecdotes and impressions from everyday life to be addressing some of these grand topics that have come up and several of those come to mind, just like last week when I was in Istanbul to visit for a short occasion. And I have, like you say, good connections with the community there, with the Greek Orthodox community, which by now is quite small, probably less than 3,000 members right now, but it's anything but marginal because this is the flock of the ecumenical patriarchate. So they are really the center of some 300 million Orthodox Christians worldwide. So this is very interesting. So now I was there having my regular runs, and I was invited to, on the day of San Bartholomew, which is the name day of the Patriarch himself. And each year he has a big celebration that takes place at the Bologna, which is a hospital and church and monastery complex out in the garden, wonderfully done. And I was thinking this is going to be a small inter-community event, which turned out to be a major. Thousands of people were there from all sorts of, backgrounds, religious or national and so on. Very high profile protocol was there, including representatives of the Ukrainian church. And of course, this brings together, and there was a part, they took part in the service as well, with a long speech and praise to the Patriarchate, and reminding us how, and that was very well received, a very emotional speech by them, among other members of the different national or ethnic churches that are connected to the Patriarchate. But it really gives you a reminder of how, as you put it, these realignment of geopolitical matters with the religious cultural heritage, and how we are reminded that we are dealing with not only the spiritual but very, actual political, sometimes even military events taking place, and to what extent religious power and cultural power is beyond symbolic gestures in dealing with these matters and having a certain dimension that takes place. So we were, that was just one of the aspects, and I don't know if anybody has been, but the Bologna Monastery is, when you enter the courtyard, there are these big marble pieces, stones, which are actually gravestones, headstones of graves, of very different Orthodox Christian graves, but in many different languages. So you have some in Arabic from Antioch. You have some Turcophone Karamanlidika with a Turkish spelling of Greek. So it really is something in a very tangible way, shows you how much this ecumenical, this global representation is taking place in something like the marble. And people are just stepping on it. It's not actual graves, but just the stones that were in a way preserved and brought back to the monastery, and just really dealing with the congregation there on a daily basis, sometimes ignored, but if you remember, it's just a really holy site. Just like the holy water, Bologna is, the IASMA is very famous for the water, and it's a very pan-religious site where people come there on special occasions, but also just for cure from diseases or for wishes to come true. And Muslims attend this just as much as any Christian or any other faith. So this interfaith dialogue is really taking in this little afternoon in this rather small communities courtyard. But at the same time, speaking to these, more global affairs, war in Ukraine, and some of the territories lost, and some of the patriarchates, like Antioch, who had to be replaced. They're not Antioch anymore and taking place in other places. So these are the kinds of ideas that come to mind, which of course is a direct provocation to rethink or to continue thinking about the status of Hagia Sophia, which for this community clearly that's their home, church in a way. It's a very emotional space each time you enter, and you very correctly pointed out the feeling, the emotion of the multisensorial emotion of the sound and the play of light in this architectural amazement, and you would expect that taken away from the grandiosity. It doesn't, but very, very interesting things happening. For example, laying out this huge carpet and cutting off that feeling of your feet with the ground, with that historical, just like the marble stones of the Bologna courtyard. You touch it with your feet as the stone. It somehow does give a different bodily sentiment that is cut off with that carpet then. But very interestingly, I don't know if anybody paid attention to this, there is this area right at the entrance to the south for the enthronement of the Byzantine emperors. They kept that. They cut it around like a puzzle piece, and they kept these ropes around it, and they have that. This is the place where the Byzantine emperors were enthroned, which really you feel like you're seeing those emperors there. It has a feel, but they cut that carpet there, nowhere else. It's just it really wonders, how people read the space and what kind of importance and power is attached to that spatial meaning, like you were saying before also. And just coming to one more thing of, adding one more sense to, sights and sounds is, it's not funny, it's tragic and comic at the same time, is the taste of it. I don't know if you have heard about last month, pieces of a wooden door or
yes.
cover
Oh my goodness.
have been found to be missing. And people reported on that. This is amazing. Just as a background, I'm sure everybody knows, but while for the decades that Hagia Sophia remained a museum, there was a very prominent sort of scientific committee there. Anything was being reviewed. You could just not, of course, put a nail on the wall, etc., clearly, as we would expect. But with the conversion to mosque, that has been rather, they installed air conditioners and carpets, and these covers of the iconas and the pictures of depictions of facial depictions. So to put these screens in front of them, of course, they had to intervene with the space somehow, physically, which came under much criticism. So there are people following what's happening, and they reported in social media that pieces of that wooden ring were missing. But it didn't look like it was, the work of a woodworm or somebody taking it out, or it was just broken through an impact. And later on, they figured out that these were actually literally pieces taken because they are considered to be holy, and they were thought to be, and of course the xenophobic Turkish media reported, oh, they're foreigners, so that see, Muslims don't do things like this. But it is murmured that they make it into powder and dust and kind of consume it, eat it, as if it's a holy water, let's say. So it's part of the holiness of the space. I don't know. So this adds to all these other different thoughts. And just maybe from taste and eating, we could, because you mentioned UNESCO and because you mentioned Cyprus and Greece and Turkey, intangible cultural heritage, I'm compelled to go to the topic of food, but I will stop here. If it comes back, we will.
Now you begin to appreciate why I have brought Eli here, because she represents a number of things. So she's an exile from her own city to Athens, but she also represents something which I think it's a very important central focal point, intellectual central focal point for any engagement with cultural heritage, for which I use the Augustinian expression common objects of love, or common objects of love. That when we approach religious cultural heritage, we have to find this ground and context where we really have this multiple angles through which we could find common objects of love. And Eli, as well as one of my dear friends, Emre Oktem, who is a very distinguished human rights lawyer who works on religious freedom, and he's also very devout Sufi, write more about Christian religious cultural heritage sites in Istanbul than anybody else I know. And they're Muslims, they're not Christians, but they love in their different way and appreciate in their different way cultural heritage which matters for them, even though they don't necessarily worship in those contexts. And increasingly, that is obviously on a kind of more philosophical and theological level a very important point, but it also raises a number of other settings, looking in what has been happening through this transformation of religious sites, of how a focus on religious cultural heritage would inevitably have to address the elephant in the room, which is the legacy of empires. That from Turkey to Russia and India, we deal with the same challenge, but in different form and different manifestation, of a reclaiming of spaces which were once imperial spaces, by weaponizing cultural heritage to do so, denying others their right to existence, denying others their right to cultural self-identity and religious freedom or cultural self-determination, by claiming a monolithic understanding of culture, which was very much driven by the Soviet model, which was very much driven by the Ottoman model. And the Ottoman example and the Hagia Sophia example as a sobering reminder why policymakers should take those things more seriously. Because creating this kind of new imperial models by using cultural heritage today is very dangerous, because as far as the new Ottoman revival Erdogan is concerned, they send shockwaves to any post-Ottoman subjects, because whatever the neo-Ottoman revival today may be, any post-Ottoman subjects in the Balkans and beyond would view the Ottoman period as a political, cultural and civic blackout, from turning them from 14th century near Renaissance level of cultural development to a complete blackout. And many of them claim that they still haven't recovered from this, and that anything from the Balkan Wars to the Cyprus crisis to the wars of Yugoslavia are a result of really trying to come to terms with these political, civic and cultural traumas. And these are things with which you cannot play, because culture or monopolizing of culture is likely to be an early warning of a war on its way. And so the new Ottoman project, the new Hindu project in India, and the war in Ukraine are very much following this path. The denial of self-determination, cultural self-determination for Ukrainians because they're culturally Russian. Denial of cultural self-determination of Estonia because they're culturally within the Russian sphere of influence. And these are things we should take more seriously, not view culture as something only upper classes appreciate in their pastime and they don't concern everybody else, but should actually link it with very concrete and robust political concerns. Now it's time to bring Mario into the conversation. Mario and I have had multiple occasions to not cross swords, but certainly to engage into deeper end questions of religious cultural heritage. And in fact, the first Eware panel on religious cultural heritage was with Cole, Mario, and Alberto. So Great to have you back and to have this symbolic reunion.
Thank you. So my observation about this discourse has to do with insightful observations proffered by Professor Meloni before, as regards the divide, the separation between meaning and things. The protection of things is not the protection of meanings, but my question is, how much this separation is rooted in the epistemology of secularization? The idea that the epistemology of secularization, to be intended not as an idea about religion development, as we're calling Hegel's philosophy of history or Hegel's philosophy of religion, but on the contrary, the epistemological approach to reality and the divide between mind and the world out there. I think that the main problem with the protection of cultural heritage is the definition of heritage as a thing, something that is completely detached from the imagination of people. On the contrary, things out there are only epitomes of a lot of relationships that are dynamic and actively carried out with the environment. So from this point of view, our idea that reality is made only by the primary qualities that we can recognize universally, and what is subjective is all the rest. It's completely wrong. If we see the world from a relational perspective, we can understand that this kind of insulation of things from our imagination for the forum internum and its projection, separated in the name of freedom, is only a rhetorical device to manage political, religious, interdenominational struggles in the dawn of modernity. But this implies the recollection without insight, our view of out there reality, of our subjective projection of it, produced by our relational intercourse with experience. So, for example, if I say the bottle is made of plastic, it can contain water at the form of, for example, a glass. But in this representation, there is only a part of the meaning of the bottle. Just because the meaning of the bottle has to do with our need of water, our ability, in a sense, to drink from the bottle or from a glass. We have a mouth, we have an arm, we have the ability to move this to satisfy our needs, our biological needs. All this is invisible. But this invisible or intangible is part and parcel, and it is constitutive, or our idea of what is out there. Is we, for hypothesis, subtract what is invisible, the visible changes meaning completely. It's categorized in another way. So we almost silently onward put that there is a divide between what is universal, real, and what is subjective. But this subjectivity is not peripheral in the determination of what is out there. This has a lot of political implication, I think, but especially from a cognitive point of view. This is because if we think of facts as something that is made by ourselves, according to its etymological origin, facts comes from Latin facere. Human beings make things. And our representation, according to the modern divide between what is subjective and objective, is only the result of the subtraction of subjectivity from the objectivity, the subtraction of intersubjectivity and the transformation of it in something that is objective. There. How much of Christian approach to reality is concealed in our landscape of concepts, categorizations about reality, how much colonization and also post-colonization influences this. And so also the politics and our imagery of pluralism. And lots of different views about only one reality out there. But what is true is that facts are the epitome of the interaction between different subjectivities and what is out there. So the reality is in this sort of phenomenological, but not only phenomenological, relational, I prefer to say, just because I want to subtract something that is ontological, So I think that is transformative. This has to do, I think, with the sustainability also, not only with regard to the heritage, the cultural heritage, but also with the environment taken as a whole. This is important, I think, also for a legal point of view, just because in the construction or the medium term of legal syllogism, for example, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, Socrates is mortal. But the second premise of syllogism, Socrates is a human being, is an hypothesis. Who said to you that Socrates is a human being? What is out there is a result of our interpretation, the assumption of a lot of values and hands that select from the flux of connotations, denotations, perceptions, something that is to be included in the category. This operation is an operation of translation, also in this case with regard to the etymological origins, translation, transduction, like a metaphor. Metaphoras in modern Greek is translocation. But this operation is a creative operation. For this reason, the consequences of the assumption of the protection with regard to things, and only in a second time, the protection of the subjective projections, superstitious, no rational, about things, under the name of freedom, is inherently discriminatory. Just because the divide between what is real, what is external, what is subjective, carry that in the name of freedom. Because in the dawn of modernity, we have to judge from a legal point of view people for what they do, not what they think or believe. Transformed, transfigured in a cage for freedom, in particular for religious freedom. Just because what is the inside, the domain of private sphere, cannot go out, cannot influence, remote the categorization of what is objective that is out there. This is a sort of meta-implication of secularization, the at-present origins, the divide between forum internum and forum externum. This is a deep problem that has an epistemological relevance, more than the political one. From my point of view, for example, it's very interesting that the reflection, the thought, the criticism about the lack of secularization traditionally has been regarding the public sphere, the political dimension. Almost never private law, criminal law in its specific articulation, as regard, for example, stealing. What is the relationship between things and persons? It's completely assumed as clear, self-evident. But this self-evidence is crammed with culture. But of this, it's impossible to speak. If you see the conflicts about, the claims about the identity, the protection of cultural difference, they had to do with something that is very, very exotic. Aside, what is central? For example, conjugal law, the idea of good faith, the idea of equity, the idea of guilt, penal responsibility. Think of, for example, the relationship between the language that has an accusatory structure and the other languages that are a completely different idea of the relationship between things and subjects. For example, the languages that assume that things make things to the subject. How to reconstruct the idea of responsibility? You have to translate metaphorically like this. But what is interesting, all these institutions has to do with daily life. So that in the construction of the medium term of legal syllogism, that is thought as nothing that has to do with translation. What is assumed is this connection between the normativity and the legal language that includes silently the world of things as imagined. First of all, separated, first entrance, and then crammed with a lot of categories carried by secularization all over the world, silently too. So, sorry, I know. But from this point of view, it's very interesting that the legal theology, we can say, with regard to this institution, is something that has to do with the deprivatization of religion. It's impossible in this field, just because, in my view, with regard to this legal theology, the privatization of religion never took place. In the worldwide imaginary regarding legal practices, and so the world of things, because it's nested in our language about quotidian life. All this is completely overlooked. There is no criticism. We speak a lot about veils, infibulations, sacred places, but it's already defined as different from the world of objective. This is the reason for which a stone cannot be understood as intrinsically already in its materiality as the production of another world. They have the same legitimacy as the other projections. This is very interesting, sorry.
No, you're doing absolutely fine. Jose, did you?
Well, because
you
are
hinted some
promoting the secularization thesis. I think that we are beyond. As you know, my book, Public Religions in the Modern World, the title in Italian is Oltre la secolarizzazione. And we are living in a post-secular global world, nostra etate, which is not anymore defined by European modernity. One of the examples in the lecture I gave on sacred places was about the Camino de Santiago. Mm-hmm. A pilgrimage, cultural heritage, which was central for medieval Christendom throughout, right? We know it was central for centuries in medieval Christendom. Then disappeared for 500 years. Then the Franco regime tried to revive it as a formula for national Catholicism, didn't have any success. And then somehow, out of nowhere, came and was a practice that has been revived, and it's a practice that is sacred for Catholics, which link it to their Catholic heritage, but for ecologists and creationists, for people, so they find their own sacred meaning in this practice, and it's linked to. So the point I'm making is precisely to make sacred places open for multiple experiences of the sacred, which is not controlled by the state, is not controlled by any church, and is not controlled by. So the opportunity in our world of religious pluralism to open sacred places to multiple sacred experiences, both sacred in the religious sense of particular traditions, but sacred in the spiritual sense of people, for which this spiritual has meaning, although may not be religiously sacred for them. So this is why I think that's why the secularization thesis here, I think of course, it's still there. In many places, this is what is at stake, the state trying to take over.
But what is there? A bridge, if it's transformed in a moment of Camino de Santiago, it's transformed not only from a representative point of view, but also with regard to the consequences, pragmatic consequences of things. So the bridge becomes something else that epitomizes all the human actions that are connected to this in a retrospective and in a perspective, from a perspectival point of view. So the present reality of the bridge is a sort of synthesis, but I have to put together all these projections that are part and parcel of the checklist of categorization. This is important just because from this point of view, we have to renew our reading of the objective reality out there to translate as a multiple metaphorical operation, all not perspectives on the same things, but different making of the thing. Only from this point of view, we can speak of a sort of equidistant secular language, open to diversity. Just because if I assume that the thing out there is only one, and I conceal in this categorization the Christian cultural approach to reality, the divide between spiritual and material, between forum internum and forum externum, etc., that is completely absent in other imageries, I'm already making a discrimination. Because whatever balancing will start unbalanced. Because I include already, before starting, something subjective in my rendering of objectivity. This is a huge problem. From this point of view, the protection of cultural and religious heritage has to avoid and divert, I think, the idea of heritage, the thinghoods of things, and on the contrary, have to translate the surroundings, the implications of this material, the building, the thing. And then, only then, we can rewrite and remold the meaning of the thing as a result of this translational task as an object of protection, of legal protection. Otherwise, the construction of the medium term of legal symbolism will be always a deceptive operation.
Well, I'm sympathetic with that, and in a way, we all, in some ways, sympathetic to this idea that the original format of cultural heritage is very empirical. It's very sort of museum-driven, museum-centered, and the proposal of religious cultural heritage, which of course doesn't exist as a normative category. There is an international law of religious cultural heritage. We use it as a scholarly tool to actually rattle the feathers, to turn upside down the existing system without destroying it, but also to propose that if we have a more holistic focus on religious cultural heritage, we are more capable of capturing this tangible and intangible, places, people, and processes which do different things with the same buildings, and those things may be perfectly legitimate rather than being approached through a territorial perspective, that this is either a religious site or a museum, but cannot be both. Or this is a site which is a property to a Muslim waqf, and therefore nobody else could go and pray there, because they would claim, they would assert a property claim on their religious territory. So it's really a bit of a subversive proposal, and as I said, we're really testing the waters of how we could imagine those new trajectory and think about those, because clearly there is no consensus about it, but there's clearly an emerging trend which suggests that the more we think about those places as working places, as religious sites, but also as places which may be important for environmentalists, for indigenous people, for the public which wants to walk into religious natural sites as a national park, this is going to unpack this monopoly that the state would have to have a top-down way of regulating, and makes us all co-participants of the articulation of the public reason and sharing the way, stakeholders in the way those things are done. And it's going to be a long process, but this seems to be the only process which is likely to challenge this more monolithic ways of challenging cultural heritage. and deal in a meaningful way with the imperial legacies, because we must be reminded that modern legal system of cultural heritage protection and the emergence of the concept of cultural heritage was has emerged in the period of the consolidation of the modern empires, and it was everything from the great museums which we all love were in a way a testament to the success of the modern empires, and we have no way but to relate to that, not by shutting down the museums, but really reimagining those spaces. Alberto.
Well, there is something I'd like to add to the discussion that is very stimulating and interesting. From my point of view, there are two aspects that will pick up both of the intervention that they've made. On the side, I do agree we should be careful about the language of heritage. I have a personal series of tragic defeat in linguistic aspect. I've lost my battle trying to avoid the use of radical instead of terroristic for Islamist terrorism. In Italy, radical is a rather noble word, and so to say to somebody, if you go to Pope Francis and to ask him, Holy Father, do you like to be a radical Christian or a moderate one? Of course, we said a radical boy. What are you speaking of? And I'm sure that if I go to my wife asking her, my darling, do you prefer to be radically married to you or moderately married to you? If she stays moderately, I have something to correct in my behaviors. And I think that also the war on heritage is lost. But the wording is very dangerous because heritage supposes the death of the owner.
Yeah.
So it's a typical language, and the other wording is not very much better. The Roman law divided patrimony and matrimonium. The men was bringing property, women were bringing kids, and so patrimonium and matrimonium are cultural patrimony is not much better. But there is something that for me is challenging, exactly the point of the faith in post-secularization, in post-secular society. Because on what for me it's important and interesting is how religious experience is capable to root the respect of the other and the welcoming of a difference in its own faith. That is not necessarily sacred. It is not necessarily expressed into standardized religious format, but is much more important than any other aspect. And so the way in which you manage these places is speaking of what is happening. If you have time, go to Santa Maria della Vita, in the center of the city, to see il compianto. It is a series of statues representing the dead Christ and the women and friends coming on him crying. And this is an extraordinary piece of 15th century art in expressionist view. It's more or less Bergman 5 centuries before without a camera. So the church was owned by a bank because the fraternity that was there became an hospital, that became public, and it became part of the patrimony of the bank. And you pay a ticket to see the compianto. So the fact that you pay a ticket is good, bad, proper, not, is something that gives another meaning to the sense. And the compianto is in a chapel, and in order to respect formalistically the reality of the church, if you go to the mass, you don't pay, of course. But to see the compianto, that is part of the church, you have to pay. And so this means that the subtlety of the use is not not only the big one that he was mentioning about Hagia Sophia and so on, but it's the fact of creating the room and the space for perceiving the faith of the faithful, also for those who have not the faith. It is the issue of Santiago, it is the issue of the crowning square in Hagia Sophia, and so on. And in this, I think there is a great challenge, because in some circumstances, you have churches and faith communities who are simply asking for protection because it costs money and it is complicated to manage with regulations. And on the other, they ask this for a sort of symbolic, creating much more damage than other aspect. It's one of the things that is interesting from my point of view is to write a biography on the wording concerning Christianophobia, that is representing the Christian in the Middle East, that has the most ancient community, the most ancient heritage of the Christian churches, as something that is there like if they were Franciscan missionaries of the 18th century. And so changing the profile of the people there. From this point of view, I think that the issue of the holy places must be extended to the holiness of faith and the way in which pluralistic society in a post-secular age may find a way to include the respect of the other in your own principles. On this sense, the New Testament as a wonderful episode that is the Eulogia of Jesus concerning John the Baptist. That was definitely never became a Christian, John the Baptist. And the idea that the biggest one is the other. And the only way to become big is to become small in front of him. That is a neglected verse of the New Testament, because it says that in an iconostasis in the text of the Gospel, you have this side of alterity included just because to help your hypoglycemia. I will remember always in Boston when we had a discussion about the Jewish Jesus, and one of the sisters said, okay, I didn't understand that Jesus was a Jew, but his mother was definitely Catholic.
Well, this very lively conversation makes me think that I would say something I would have never imagined I would say about the connection between the reform of the Code of Canon Law of the Catholic Church and the reimagining of cultural heritage protection in the 21st century. So during the revision of the first Code of Canon Law of the Catholic Church, the great medieval canon law historian Stefan Kuttner had essentially proposed an urgent decodification of the code rather than a revision. And his proposal was that the original Code of Canon Law was wrong in structure because it replicated the structure of the Justinianic Code, and it was divided to persons, things, and action. And in canon law and in the life of the church, in the life of sacred, there aren't clear boundaries between persons, things, and action, and the relationships are much more fluid, and that the medieval decretals reflect that much better than the modern Code of Canon Law. And since we're in Bologna, the cradle of European canon law, it seems that this distinguished panel seems to be leaning towards a similar proposal, that we need to find a new grammar of thinking of cultural protection beyond cultural heritage, beyond empirical labels, and beyond rigid distinguishing between persons and things. And like all good things, this one has to come to an end as well, because we're due to a well-deserved lunch break. But we shall continue after the lunch break with the final round table. We're just going to wrap up and capture most of the things we have discussed for the last 2 days, and really try to see what to steer further into and what to leave out simply because it's a non-starter, or it's not taking us anywhere. So thank you for being with us, and thank you to our speakers. We've lost one of them, but I'm sure that he enjoyed himself at least as much as I did. So once again, thank you, and look forward to seeing you after lunch.